Hi, I'm Tim from timsteppingout.com, and today I wanted to talk about the connection between the Marcionites and the Book of Revelation, or the community that originally produced it. The first time I thought that there might be a connection between Revelation and the Gospel of Mark is when I noticed in Mark 16 the young man dressed in white who was revealing to people that Jesus had risen, that Jesus was gone from the tomb. That seems to be a preceding idea to the revealer in Revelation 1:12, who was an older man dressed in white. So in that sense, Mark became a prequel to Revelation. And given the time frame that the Gospel of Mark was supposedly based in, which was the late 20s, early 30s, that makes a lot of sense, considering that Revelation clearly makes use of Josephus' Wars of the Jews, was clearly written about the temple destruction, or at least with making reference to the temple destruction. And of course it was aware of later events too, which makes it, I think, clear that Revelation had undergone a lot of changes between maybe the year 75 and maybe into the mid-2nd century, following the Second Jewish-Roman War in around 115, and maybe even aware of Bar Kokhba. As I mentioned in an earlier video, I think that this Cerinthus character is actually the person at the root of the Peter character, or the Cephas character in the Gospel story. And the reason I think that is because I think that the Gospel of Mark is aware of at least Galatians, where Paul is talking about opposing Cephas to his face. And so if Cephas is Cerinthus, you can see this evolution in docetic thought from the Cerinthian view to the more Marcionite view, and I've talked about that in other videos too. But it's basically this evolution where Jesus becomes less and less human, where in Cerinthian's version it was the Christ that descended onto Jesus, and Jesus encapsulated the Christ for some time. Marcion was completely just a phantom, and so he wasn't even really flesh or material at all. And so you see that evolution. And of course, the other factor in this Marcionite connection is that Marcion was said to have used a hacked up version of the Gospel of Luke, a version of the Gospel of Luke that lacked a birth story, which is very similar to Mark in that regard. So I think Mark and Luke were probably having some interplay, and one community went one way with the story and another community went another way. And so that's why you get a divergence. And it might have been that people who were later adjusting Luke had become aware of the Gospel of Matthew, which was an Ebionite text. You can't really look at Marcion without considering Paul, or considering the tight connection between Marcion and Paul. There's something really weird going on. I mean, even if you're not really open to a lot of conspiracy type of things, which, admittedly, my view is a little bit of a conspiracy theory, I'm sorry to say, because that's not the kind of person I tend to be, or the sort of views I tend to espouse, but I think there was a lot of conspiring and funny business going on. And when you're looking at Marcion and Paul, there's just a really, really interesting connection between the two, in that Marcion, who had the opportunity to say, oh, Peter's the best, or John's the best, or whatever other apostle was the best, he chose Paul, who admittedly never even knew Jesus. So what is going on there? That seems really weird. And the fact that Marcion's canon was composed almost entirely of Pauline letters, not even just the 4 or 6 authentic ones, but he also included Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, which all seem to be Gnostic aware, which in my mind adds weight to the notion that there was another evolution that was about to go on from Marcionism to a more Gnostic view, perhaps Valentinianism. In my opinion, it's almost certainly the case that Marcion wrote Galatians and he wrote 2 Corinthians 10 and after. If you look at 2 Corinthians 12, he talks about a person he knew who was taken up to the third heaven and saw unspeakable things. If you didn't know anything about conventional timelines, but you knew about the books of the Bible, you would look at this and you would say, oh, he must be talking about Revelation, the book of Revelation, John's Apocalypse. And yet, that couldn't possibly be under conventional dating because Revelation was supposedly written after 100. It must have been because John the Apostle or John the Evangelist or whoever you want to say and pretend wrote Revelation. He wrote it while being imprisoned by Domitian on the island of Patmos, or at the tail end of the first century. That's what the tradition holds. So it couldn't possibly be that Paul, who was writing in the mid-first century, was making reference to Revelation. Of course, if you assume that it's all nonsense, that the Paul letters were written by Marcion in the 2nd century, then it's really no problem at all. And it's really also no problem at all if you assume that Revelation was probably one of the first Christian texts, maybe written in at the tail end of the 1st century, which is pretty close to what tradition holds, not by John, but by Cerinthus. There were multiple groups who were claiming that Cerinthus wrote Revelation. And you can't help but wonder if in Against Heresies, when Irenaeus talks about John encountering Cerinthus in a bathhouse and running away screaming, "Let us fly, the enemy of the truth, Cerinthus is within," if that was Irenaeus' nod to that rumor that had been going around, and it was his way to combat that rumor, or what I suspect was common knowledge that Irenaeus was trying to rewrite and write down. There are two other accounts that I think bridge this Revelation Marcionite community very well. In one case, you've got Hippolytus in Against All Heresies talking about Apelles, who was a Marcionite disciple, who took around with him someone named Philomene, a woman named Philomene, who had written a book called Revelations. As if that isn't a connection enough, I noticed something else when I was looking into that. There's a Greek myth called the myth of Philomela. Philomene is a shortened name for Philomela. And in the myth of Philomela, Philomela is raped and has her tongue cut out by her sister's husband. And so as to prevent Philomela from telling anyone about it, her brother-in-law cuts out her tongue and sends her off and essentially imprisons her by casting her off. Eventually, Philomela is able to convey what happened to her sister, and in response, she and her sister take their son, the brother-in-law and the sister's son, and boils him and feeds him to the husband who had raped and detongued Philomela. And he realizes this, and he starts chasing after them, after the sister and Philomela. And they pray to the gods, and the gods turn all three of them into birds. And Philomela escapes from her brother-in-law after turning into a bird. So that's kind of this obscure story, right? But I noticed something else, too. When you read Against Heresies, Irenaeus talks about Simon Magus, who's taking around a woman with him. And this woman calls herself Helen of Troy. It's a really kind of weird thing. I mean, it seems like all these people are nuts, right? But when you look at the story of Helen of Troy, her father is Zeus and her mother is Leda. And Zeus had met Leda because Zeus was into shenanigans, as was usually the case, and he had turned into a swan. And he was being chased by an eagle, and he was running away from the swan, or from the eagle, and he met Leda, and impregnated Leda, and there you get Helen of Troy. At some point in her life, Helen of Troy was imprisoned as well. But one of the other interesting details is that Helen of Troy is the sister of Castor and Pollux, who are the Boanerges, or the sons of thunder. And there's a little bit of a nuance in that relationship. But what's interesting is that the Castor and Pollux are referenced twice in the New Testament. Once in Mark 3:17, I think. Also in Acts 28:11. So what I think is happening in these conveying of the stories is that it's part of the mystery. You've got the themes of the bird and the transformation of the bird, and you've got themes of imprisonment, and you've got all kinds of different things like that. And then when you look back at the Gospel of Mark, which appears to have borrowed this Cerinthian notion that the dove is that the Christ in the form of a dove is descending on Jesus, and afterwards Jesus encapsulates the Christ within his body. I think this is just a theme. I think these are just details of the mystery that had been assembled and that were being used by various communities who were sort of advancing this narrative. But what is interesting is that in several occasions in the Pauline letters, in Philemon and then in Ephesians isn't authentic, but Paul makes a point to say, I am a prisoner of Christ. The fact that you've got this theme of imprisonment in these tertiary stories that the heresy hunters are telling about the heretics. It really is interesting, and you can't help but wonder if there is some connection there. I certainly do think that there is some connection there. So just to sum up what I think, how I think the evolution happened here, that brought us from Revelation to the Marcionites, is I think that this Cerinthian type community developed. They thought there was a fall from the Godhead. They saw the Christ coming down onto a person, Jesus as it were, as it was, and so you've got this Messiah sort of teaching and delivering prophecy and stuff like that. I think that idea came after Revelation, because in Revelation you've got this old man delivering prophecy material to the narrator of Revelation. And so I think what ended up happening, to support my sort of mythicist view, what I think happened was the community evolved from it being just this old man delivering some kind of prophecy to it actually being a person in history that they plucked out of the history book, Josephus' Wars of the Jews. They found a person who knew that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. As far as I can tell, that's the only person who knew years before that Jerusalem was toast, and it was Jesus ben Ananias. So that's what I think was happening. That's the evolution of the thought, I think. And so this Cerinthian community, which can be linked to the Petrine type of Christianity, it believes in this fall from the Godhead, but maybe it's not so detached from its Judaism than subsequent versions of Docetism were. However, right away you've got a conflict because the Ebionites respond to it and they say, no, there is not a separate God. And so I think that interplay back and forth between those communities brought on the evolution of Mark and Matthew, or a proto-Mark and proto-Matthew. And then you've got Marcionism, which strays even further from the Ebionites while still being in the same line as Cerinthianism, except it believes that Christ isn't even flesh, isn't even material. And so out of that, I think you get the development of the Gospel of Luke, which I think may have an impact on both Mark and Matthew, in the sense that it gives rise to the virgin birth. And so as Luke evolves down the line, as it goes out of the control of the Marcionites and into the control of more of the pre-orthodoxy, you get the injection of the virgin birth just like Matthew has. But I think that the Nazarenes put the virgin birth into Matthew prior to the virgin birth getting into Luke. And I think that this was all done, certainly by 180. It might have even been done in the 150s or 160s. But anyway, that's all I have to say today. Thanks.